Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Amid the red earth and the wine-swept canyons of the Arizona Territory, a story was born from violence and nurtured by an unexpected tenderness. This is not a tale of high-noon gunfights or rowdy saloons, but a story about the whispers of the heart in a world screaming with war. It is the story of a woman stripped of everything and a warrior torn between honor and an impossible love, a story proving that even in the harshness of the Wild West, seeds of compassion can take root in the most barren places. So sit back and listen to the wind as it carries their story. The sun bled across the western sky, painting the vast and forgiving expanse of the Arizona Territory in hues of orange, purple, and blood. For Alara, the sunset was no longer a thing of beauty. It was a daily reminder of another day survived and a harbinger of the long, perilous night to come. The raw and tamed land stretched out in every direction, a tapestry of cacti-studded plains, jagged mesas, and shadowed canyons that seemed to swallow the light. It was a land that promised everything and gave nothing, a place where life was as fragile as a desert flower. Her family had come west 3 years ago, drawn by the siren song of the Homestead Act and the promise of 160 acres to call their own. They had left behind the gentle, rolling hills of Pennsylvania, a world of predictable seasons and close-knit communities, for this crucible of dust and stone. Her father, a man of quiet determination and unyielding optimism, had seen a future in the stubborn soil. Her mother, though her heart never truly left the green of her homeland, had created a semblance of civilization in their small sod brick house. And her younger brother Thomas, with his boundless energy and fascination with the wild creatures of this new world, had been the light that held their small family together. They had been warned, of course. Fort Grant was a full day's ride away, and the patrols were infrequent. The Apache, the true masters of this land, were a constant and seen presence. Stories of their raids, whispered in hushed tones by other settlers, were the stuff of nightmarish tales of swift, brutal violence that left behind only ashes and silence. But her father, ever the pragmatist, believed in hard work and a sturdy rifle. He believed that if they respected the land would, in turn, respect them. It was a fatal miscalculation. The attack had come at dawn, just as the first sliver of sun crested the distant Dragon Mountains. There was no warning, no war cry to break the morning calm. One moment, Alara was fetching water from the well, the cool air crisp against her cheeks. The next, the world had erupted into a maelstrom of chaos and terror. They moved like ghosts, their lean, powerful bodies painted with ochre and black, their movements a blur of deadly efficiency. They were not the savages of dime novels. They were warriors, their faces grim masks of purpose, their eyes burning with a righteous fury that Alara could not comprehend. Her father had been the first to fall, his rifle only half raised before an arrow found its mark. Her mother's scream was cut short, a sound that would haunt Alara's waking and sleeping moments for the rest of her days. She had tried to reach Thomas, to shield his small body with her own, but she was seized from behind, her arms pinned by a grip of iron. She was forced to watch as their small homestead, the product of 3 years of sweat, blood, and hope, was consumed by flames. The life they had so carefully built was undone in a matter of minutes. She was the only one they spared. Why, she did not know. A prize? A slave? The uncertainty was a cold knot of dread in her stomach. They bound her hands with rawhide and threw her onto a horse with the callous indifference one might show a sack of grain. As they rode away, Alara did not look back. She could not bear to see the smoking ruins of her past. She fixed her gaze on the broad, muscular back of the warrior who rode before her, the man who was now her captor, her jailer, her fate. He was a formidable presence, even from behind. His long, black hair was held in place by a simple leather band, and a single eagle feather was tied into a lock at the back. His buckskin shirt and leggings were worn but well maintained, and a quiver of arrows was slung across his back, alongside a rifle that looked disconcertingly like the ones used by the U.S. Army. He moved with the horse as if they were one being, his body a study in fluid strength and absolute control. For days, they rode. The landscape became a blur of red rock and pale sand, the sun a relentless hammer in the sky. Alara drifted in and out of a state of shock, the horror of which she had witnessed replaying itself in her mind in a never-ending loop. The Apaches spoke little, communicating through a series of hand gestures and guttural sounds that were as alien to her as the landscape itself. They moved with a speed and endurance that was nothing short of superhuman, living off the land in a way that defied everything she knew. They found water where there was only dry rock and food in the spiny, uninviting plants of the desert. Her captor, the warrior who seemed to be the leader of the small raiding party, never spoke to her. He did, however, show a strange, almost imperceptible form of consideration. When they stopped to rest, he would untie her hands, and a gourd of water would be placed silently beside her. When the desert night grew cold, a worn buffalo hide would be tossed in her direction. These were not acts of kindness, she told herself. They were the actions of a man preserving his property. To think otherwise was to invite a hope that would surely be crushed. On the fourth day, as they were navigating a narrow, winding canyon, one of the other warriors, a man with a cruel sneer and a long, jagged scar down his face, approached her. He spoke in rapid, harsh tones, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. He reached out to grab her arm, but before his fingers could touch her, her captor was there, a shadow moving with the speed of a striking snake. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw a weapon. He simply stood between Alara and the other warrior and spoke a few low, sharp words. The scarred warrior's face contorted with anger, and for a moment, Alara thought there would be violence. But then, with a final glare of hatred directed at her, he backed away. Her captor turned and looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. It was the first time he had truly looked at her, and in that fleeting moment, she saw something beyond the cold facade of a ruthless warrior. It was not pity, not kindness, but something akin to acknowledgement. He saw her, not as a prize or a slave, but as a person. And then the mask was back in place, and he turned and walked away. That night, as she lay shivering under the buffalo hide, staring up at a sky littered with more stars than she had ever imagined, a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She was a captive, alone in a hostile world, her life in the hands of men who had destroyed her family. And yet, in the midst of her despair, a tiny, defiant seed of will began to sprout. They had taken everything from her, but they would not take her spirit. She would survive. She would watch, she would learn, and she would find a way to endure. She would not let them break her. The warrior had a name. She had heard the others say it. No Kai. And Alara swore to herself, under the vast, indifferent gaze of the cosmos, that no Kai would come to know her name as well. The journey to the Apache stronghold was a brutal education in survival. Each day was a relentless test of endurance, a trial by sun, stone, and silence. The world Alara had known, with its soft comforts and structured routines, had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, aching reality of the present moment. Her body, unaccustomed to the rigors of constant travel, screamed in protest. Her muscles burned, her skin was blistered by the sun, and the rawhide bonds, though loosened when they rested, had chafed her wrists raw. But physical pain was a dull ache compared to the sharp, ever-present agony of her grief. The Apache warriors moved through the unforgiving terrain with a grace and ease that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. They were a part of this land, their senses attuned to its subtle rhythms in a way Alara could barely fathom. They read the signs in the dust, the flight of a hawk, the rustle of a lizard in the brush. They were hunters, predators in their own domain, and she was their prey, a creature of a different world, clumsy and vulnerable. No Kai remained a distant, enigmatic figure. He led the party with an air of quiet authority, his commands issued with a simple gesture or a single, low word. He continued to ensure her basic survival, but his detachment was as impenetrable as the canyon walls that now surrounded them. He would leave water for her, a piece of tough, smoked venison, or a handful of wild berries, but he never met her gaze. His actions were practical, efficient, and devoid of any discernible emotion. Alara learned to read him in other ways. She watched the way he sat his horse, the subtle shifts in his posture that signaled his awareness of their surroundings. She saw the way his hand would rest on the hilt of his knife when they passed a place that felt exposed or dangerous. He was a man constantly on alert, his entire being focused on the singular purpose of leading his warriors and their captives safely through the wilderness. He was, she realized with a chilling certainty, incredibly good at what he did. The incident with the scarred warrior, whose name she learned was Kale, had created a subtle but palpable shift in the group's dynamics. Kale now watched Nokai with a sullen resentment, his animosity toward Alara barely concealed. The other warriors seemed to hold Nokai in high regard, deferring to his judgment without question, but there was a new tension in the air, a silent conflict that simmered just beneath the surface. Alara understood that she was the cause of it, a foreign element that had disrupted their harsh, ordered world. One afternoon, as they were making their way through a narrow pass, the sky, which had been a flawless expanse of blue, turned a bruised, angry gray with astonishing speed. The temperature dropped, and the wind began to whip through the canyon, carrying the scent of rain and dust. A flash of lightning illuminated the darkening sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder that echoed off the rock walls. The warriors immediately sought shelter in a shallow overhang, pulling the horses in close. The rain came in a sudden, violent deluge, turning the dry creek bed into a raging torrent in a matter of minutes. Alara huddled against the cold stone, her thin dress soaked through, shivering uncontrollably. The sheer power of the storm was terrifying, another manifestation of this land's violent, untamable nature. She saw Nokai speaking with his men, his expression grim. He looked over at her, his brow furrowed. He then unwrapped a heavy, old canvas from his pack and, without a word, walked over and draped it around her shoulders. The canvas was stiff and smelled of horse and smoke, but it blocked the wind and the driving rain, creating a small pocket of relative warmth. It was a gesture of profound practicality, yet it felt like something more. He had seen her shivering, had recognized her vulnerability to a force that his own people were far better equipped to handle. He moved to sit a few feet away, his back against the rock, his rifle resting across his knees. He stared out into the storm, his face a stoic mask, but Alara felt his presence as a tangible shield against the elements. For the first time since her capture, a flicker of something other than fear stirred within her. She was still his prisoner, but in that moment, under the shelter of his canvas, she also felt protected. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. The air was cool and fresh, and the scent of wet sage filled the canyon. As the warriors prepared to move on, Nokai came to retrieve his canvas. As he took it from her, their fingers brushed. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through Alara, a spark of unexpected warmth. She looked up and met his eyes. For a fraction of a second, the warrior's mask slipped again. She saw a flicker of conflict, of a deep-seated weariness that seemed to go beyond the physical hardships of their journey. Then it was gone. He gave her a curt nod, turned, and strode back to his horse. As they resumed their journey, Alara clutched the memory of that brief contact. It was a small, insignificant thing, yet it felt monumental. It was a reminder that beneath the layers of buckskin, war paint, and grim duty, there was a man. A man who, for reasons she could not begin to understand, had chosen to shield her from a storm. They traveled for 2 more days, climbing higher into the mountains. The landscape changed, the desert giving way to sparse forests of pine and juniper. The air grew thinner, cooler. Alara knew they must be getting close to their destination. The warriors, who had been constantly vigilant, seemed to relax slightly, a subtle easing of the tension in their shoulders. This was their land, their sanctuary. Late in the afternoon on the 7th day, they emerged from a dense grove of trees onto a high plateau. Below them, nestled in a wide, well-watered valley, was a sight that made Alara's breath catch in her throat. It was the Apache settlement, the rancheria. Dozens of wickiups, dome huts made of brush and hides, were scattered across the valley floor. Smoke curled from numerous campfires, and the sounds of life barking of dogs, the laughter of children, the murmur of voice drifted up to them on the evening breeze. This was not a temporary war camp. This was a home. It was a living, breathing community, hidden away in the heart of the mountains. The warriors around her let out whoops of triumph and relief, urging their horses forward down the steep trail. Alara's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat of fear and trepidation. She had survived the journey, but a new and perhaps more dangerous ordeal was about to begin. She was about to enter the world of her enemies, a world where she was the outsider, the symbol of a people they despised. As they descended into the valley, she felt Nokai's horse slow slightly, allowing a small distance to grow between them and the other riders. It was a small gesture, perhaps meaningless, but she chose to see it as a deliberate act, a momentary separation from the boisterous return of the war party. As they rode into the heart of the Apache camp, under the curious and hostile stares of its inhabitants, Laura kept her eyes fixed on the warrior in front of her. No-Kai was her captor, but he was also the only person in this entire, terrifying world who had shown her even a shred of humanity. Her survival, she knew, depended entirely on him. The arrival at the rancheria was like stepping into another reality. The moment Alara rode into the camp, a palpable wave of hostility washed over her. The sounds of daily life faltered and died, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Faces turned towards her, dark eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity, contempt, and raw, undisguised hatred. Women stopped their work, their hands still clutching baskets or scraping tools, to stare at the white woman, the Pinda-lit-o-e, the white-eyed enemy. Children, who had been playing moments before, fell silent and scurried to hide behind their mother's skirts, peering out at her with a mixture of fear and fascination. She was a ghost at their feast, a symbol of the encroaching world that sought to destroy them. In her face, they saw the soldiers who hunted them, the settlers who stole their land and water, the miners who scarred their sacred mountains. She was not Alara, she was the embodiment of their pain and their rage. No-Kai dismounted and, with a rough but not unkind grip on her arm, pulled her from the horse. Her legs, stiff and weak from days of riding, nearly gave way, and she had to brace herself against the animal's warm flank. He led her through the center of the camp, past the flickering campfires and the hide-covered wickiups. The stares were like physical blows, and she could hear the whispers and guttural remarks that followed them. She kept her head held high, a small, desperate act of defiance. She would not show them her fear, even though it was a cold, living thing coiling in her gut. They stopped before a wickiup that was slightly larger than the others. An old man, his face a magnificent road map of wrinkles, and his long gray hair tied back in the traditional Apache style, emerged from the entrance. He carried himself with an air of immense dignity and authority. This, Alara surmised, was the chief. No-Kai spoke to him in a low, respectful tone, his words a fluid, rhythmic cadence that she could not understand. He gestured towards her, and the chief's gaze fell upon her, his eyes sharp and intelligent, seeming to look right through her, to weigh and measure her very soul. The chief listened intently, his expression unreadable. He asked a few questions, and No-Kai answered. The exchange was brief, and then the chief gave a curt nod and disappeared back into his wickiup. The audience was over. No-Kai led her away from the center of the camp to a smaller, more isolated wickiup on the periphery. It was a simple, hastily constructed shelter, clearly not meant for permanent residence. He gestured for her to enter. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dry grass and earth. A few rabbit fur blankets were piled on one side. It was a cage, but it was also a shelter. He followed her in, the small space suddenly crowded by his presence. He took out his knife, and for a terrifying moment, Alara thought he meant to harm her. Instead, he knelt and, with a few deft movements, cut the rawhide bonds from her wrists. The relief was instantaneous, a rush of blood to her numb hands that was almost painful. She rubbed her raw, chafed skin, her eyes never leaving him. He stood and, for the first time, spoke to her directly. His voice was deep and resonant, but the English words were halting, heavily accented, learned from enemies and traitors. "You stay here," he said, his tone flat and commanding. "Do not leave." He then turned and left, pulling a heavy hide flap across the entrance, plunging the small hut into semi-darkness. Alara was alone. She sank onto the pile of furs, the adrenaline that had sustained her for days finally draining away, leaving her feeling hollow and utterly exhausted. The sounds of the camp started up again, a low hum of activity that now seemed to surround her, to press in on her from all sides. She was an island in a hostile sea, and the weight of her desolation was crushing. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of fear and observation. She was a prisoner, confined to her wickiup and the small patch of ground outside it. Women and children would sometimes walk by, staring at her as if she were a strange animal in a cage. The men, the warriors, ignored her completely, their indifference a more profound insult than open hostility. Only Kale, The scarred warrior would sometimes pose and glare at her, his hatred a palpable force. No Kai was her sole link to survival. Twice a day, he would appear at her wickiup. In the morning, he would leave a small bowl of tuna, a thin cornmeal mush, and a gourd of fresh water. In the evening, it would be a piece of roasted deer, rabbit, or whatever the hunters had brought in. He never stayed, never spoke. The exchange was silent, impersonal. He was her keeper, performing his duty, nothing more. But confined and isolated as she was, Lalara was also a keen observer. She began to piece together the rhythms of the camp, to see beyond the initial terrifying impression of a savage people. She saw society with its own complex rules and structures. She saw the women, who worked from sunrise to sunset, their tasks unending. They were the backbone of the community. They gathered wood and water, prepared the food, scraped and tanned the animal hides, wove intricate baskets, and cared for the children. They were strong, resilient, their hands never idle. Their society, she began to realize, was built around them. It was the men who came and went, hunting and raiding, but it was the women who maintained the constant, steady pulse of life in the rancheria. Wealth. She saw the deep reverence they had for their children, who were treated with a mixture of firm discipline and deep affection. She saw the respect they accorded their elders, whose counsel was sought on all matters of importance. She saw the men meticulously caring for their weapons and horses, their status as warriors a sacred duty rather than a mere occupation. 34. She also saw no Kai in his own world. He was not just the grim, silent warrior who had captured her. He was a respected member of his band. She saw him speaking with the other hunters, his gestures animated as he described a hunt. She saw him sitting with the elders, his head bowed in a posture of respectful listening. She saw a young boy, no older than her Thomas had been, follow him around with an expression of pure hero worship. She once saw him from a distance, crouched by a stream, patiently showing the boy how to fletch an arrow, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising gentleness and precision. In these moments, the image of the ruthless killer who had murdered her father began to blur. The man was a contradiction, a warrior capable of brutal violence who was also a teacher, a respected voice in his community, a part of a complex social fabric. The realization did not lessen her grief or her anger, but it complicated it. It was easy to hate a monster, a faceless savage. It was much harder to hate a man. One evening, as no Kai brought her food, he hesitated at the entrance to her wickiup. He held out the wooden bowl, but his eyes were not on her. They were on a small, crude carving she had been working on. With nothing else to do, she had found a piece of softwood and had been painstakingly scratching a design into it with a sharp stony rendering of a finch, a bird that had reminded her of the ones back in Pennsylvania. He looked from the carving to her face, a question in his eyes. "It's a bird," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "From my home." He gave a slow nod, his gaze returning to the small piece of wood. He said nothing, but he stood there for a full minute, a silent observer of her small, pathetic attempt to reclaim a piece of her shattered identity. Then, as always, he left without another word. That night, something new was laid beside her bowl of stew. It was a small, finely crafted knife, its blade made of sharpened stone, its handle wrapped in smooth leather. It was not a weapon, it was a tool, a carving knife. Ilara picked it up, her fingers tracing the intricate wrapping on the handle. It was a message, an acknowledgement. He had seen her. He had understood. It was a dangerous, fragile thing, this silent communication that was growing between them. It was a thread of understanding in a world of violence and hate. And as she clutched the small knife, Ilara felt the first, tentative stirring of something that she had thought was lost to her forever, a flicker of hope. The small carving knife was a turning point. It was more than a tool, it was an opening, a subtle shift in the silent war of wills between captive and captor. Ilara understood its significance immediately. It was an acknowledgement of her humanity, a concession that she was more than just a creature to be fed and watered. It was a dangerous gift, one that could be easily misinterpreted by others in the camp, but for Ilara, it was a lifeline. She began to spend her days carving, not just the birds of her homeland, but the new world around her. She carved the sharp, angular silhouette of a yucca plant, the coiled form of a sleeping snake she'd seen near her wickiup, the proud head of an eagle. It was a way to focus her mind, to channel her grief and fear into something tangible. It was a way to impose a small amount of order on the chaos of her existence. Her confinement began to ease, though so gradually she barely noticed at first. The heavy hide flap of her wickiup was sometimes left open during the day, allowing light and air to filter in. She was tacitly allowed a slightly larger perimeter, the freedom to walk to a nearby stream to wash, though always under the watchful eyes of the camp. No one spoke to her, but the glares of pure hatred began to be replaced by looks of wary curiosity. They saw her not as a threat, but as a quiet, solitary figure, constantly occupied with her strange, silent craft. Communication with Nokai remained almost entirely nonverbal, but it grew in complexity. He would watch her carve, his stoic expression occasionally softening with a flicker of interest. One day, as she struggled to capture the likeness of a hawk, he picked up a stick and, in the dirt, drew the bird with a few swift, elegant lines. His drawing was simple but captured the essence of the creature's fierce spirit in a way her clumsy carving had not. It was a lesson, a shared moment of artistry that transcended the need for words. Slowly, tentatively, she began to learn. She listened to the sounds of the camp, the cadence of the language, the repeated phrases. She learned that meant people, tell meant water, and Gaju was a word of approval, meaning good or beautiful. She would practice the words under her breath, her tongue fumbling with the unfamiliar sounds. One evening, when Nokai brought her meal, she looked at him and said, clearly and deliberately, Gaju. She gestured to the bowl of stew. He stopped, his body going still. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw genuine surprise in his eyes. A long moment passed, and then a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He had understood. The single word was a bridge, a fragile structure built across the chasm of their two worlds. After that, the lessons became more frequent, though they were never formal. He would point to a tree and say, ties. He would gesture to the sky and say, yeah. He taught her the words for fire, for stone, for horse. It was a slow, painstaking process, a language built of single words and gestures, but it was a language nonetheless. She, in turn, would point to an object and say the English word, and he would listen, his head tilted, committing the foreign sound to memory. Their strange, silent relationship did not go unnoticed. Kale, in particular, watched them with growing suspicion and contempt. He saw Nokai's actions not as a keeper's duty, but as a betrayal. To him, Alara was the enemy, and any act of communication was an act of treason. One afternoon, Alara was by the stream, washing the wooden bowl from her morning meal. She was alone, a rare moment of solitude. Suddenly, Kale was there, his scarred face a mask of fury. He began to speak to her in rapid, angry Apache, his voice low and menacing. She could not understand the words, but his tone, his posture, the raw hatred in his eyes were terrifyingly clear. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain and fear. She tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. He yanked her towards him, his face close to hers, his breath hot and foul. Kale. The voice was like the crack of a whip. Nokai stood on the bank of the stream, not 10 feet away. He had not shouted, but his voice carried an authority that was absolute. He had his bow in his hand, not drawn, but held in a way that was more threatening than any drawn arrow. Kale froze, his hand still clamped on Alara's arm. He turned to face Nokai, a defiant sneer on his lips. The two warriors faced each other, a silent, deadly tableau. The air crackled with tension. Kale spat a few sharp words at Nokai, a clear challenge. Nokai's response was to take the slow, deliberate steps forward. He did not speak again. His eyes, as hard and dark as obsidian, were locked on Kale. He was a force of nature, an embodiment of controlled, lethal power. Alara could feel the terror rolling off Kale, despite his bravado. He was a formidable warrior, but in that moment, he was no match for the cold, focused fury of Nokai. With a curse, Kale shoved Alara away from him, sending her stumbling into the shallow water. He gave Nokai one last look of pure venom and then turned and stalked back towards the camp. Nokai did not move until Kale was gone. He stood for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Then, his posture relaxed, and he walked to the edge of the stream. He reached down and offered her his hand. Ilara hesitated. Her arm throbbed where Kale had grabbed her, and she was shaking from the encounter. But she looked at the hand offered to her, a strong, calloused hand that had both captured her and protected her, and she took it. His grip was firm and steady. He pulled her easily to her feet. "He will not touch you again," Nokai said, the words a solemn vow. She looked at the dark bruises already forming on her arm. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why do you protect me?" Nokai's gaze was intense. He looked at her, at the camp, at the mountains that ringed the valley. His expression was troubled, a storm of conflicting emotions. He was a warrior of the people. His duty was to his band, to his chief, to the memory of his ancestors who had fought and died for this land. This woman, this Binda-Lik-O-Yi, was a symbol of their destruction. Protecting her was a violation of the natural order, and defiance of his own people's righteous anger. And yet he could not let her be harmed. He had seen her spirit, her quiet resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. He saw the way she carved the wood, not with bitterness, but with a deep-seated need to create, to remember, to be. She was not just a white-eyed enemy, she was Ilara. And in his heart, a place he had thought hardened by years of war and loss, something was shifting. The rigid lines of duty and hatred were beginning to blur. He did not have the words, in her language or his own, to explain the battle that was raging inside him. So, he simply met her gaze and said the only thing that felt true. "You are in my care." It was not the answer she had expected, but it was enough. It was a declaration, a bond forged in that moment of violence by the stream. As they walked back to her wickiup in silence, Ilara knew that her fate and Nokai's were now inextricably intertwined. He had drawn a line in the sand, not just for Kale, but for the entire camp. He had claimed her, not as a prize or a slave, but as a responsibility. And in this brutal and forgiving world, that was the most profound and dangerous connection of all. The confrontation with Kale drew a line that could not be erased. Nokai's public defense of Ilara cemented her status as being under his protection, a position that brought with it both a fragile security and a heightened level of scrutiny. The camp now watched them with a new intensity. The silent, nonverbal language that had developed between them was no longer a private matter. It was a public spectacle, debated in whispers around the evening fires. For Ilara, the world of the rancheria slowly began to open. An old woman, whose name was Sansiri Morning Star, and who Ilara guessed was a relative of Nokai's, began to visit her. Sansiri's face was a network of deep wrinkles, but her eyes were bright and full of a sharp, assessing intelligence. At first, she would simply sit outside Ilara's wickiup, watching her carve while she worked on a piece of buckskin, her gnarled fingers moving with practiced skill. One day, Sansiri gestured to the ugly, infected gash on Ilara's forearm, a wound she'd received during the chaos of the raid and had been unable to properly clean. Ilara had tried to tend to it, but it was swollen, red, and hot to the touch. The old woman clicked her tongue in disapproval and disappeared, only to return a few minutes later with a small pouch. She sat before Ilara and, with surprising gentleness, took her arm. She opened the pouch and took out a poultice of crushed leaves and herbs, which she applied carefully to the wound. The mixture was cool and soothing. Sansiri then wrapped the arm with a clean strip of cloth. She spoke as she worked, her voice a low, rhythmic chant. Ilara didn't understand the words, but she knew it was a healing song, a prayer. For the next several days, Sansiri came and changed the dressing, each time applying the fresh, sweet-smelling poultice. Miraculously, the inflammation subsided, the redness faded, and the wound began to heal. It was an act of profound kindness, an offering of medicine and care from a woman who had every reason to despise her. Through Sansiri, Ilara began to see the deeper, nurturing heart of the Apache people, a side that was hidden beneath the hard exterior of the warrior culture. The bond between Ilara and Nokai also deepened, evolving beyond the simple exchange of words and objects. He began to take her with him on short excursions away from the camp, not as a prisoner being led on a rope, but as a companion. He took her to a high ridge overlooking the valley and taught her the names of the sacred mountains that surrounded them, the Kirikahuas, the Dragoons. He showed her which plants were medicine and which were poison. He pointed out the tracks of deer and mountain lions, explaining how to read the stories they left in the dust. He was a natural teacher, patient and precise. He was sharing his world with her, the world as he saw it, a living, breathing entity, filled with spirits and power, where every rock, every tree, every creature had a purpose and a story. 56. She learned that the Apache did not see themselves as owners of the land, but as a part of it, bound by a sacred compact to live in harmony with it. It was a stark contrast to the settlers' view of land as something to be tamed, fenced, and owned. During these walks, he would sometimes speak of his past, not in long narratives, but in brief, poignant fragments. He spoke of his wife and young son, lost not to the white soldiers, but to a fever that had swept through the camp several winters ago. The loss had hollowed him out, leaving behind a quiet, tightly controlled grief that he rarely allowed to surface. Alara, in turn, found herself able to speak of her own family. She told him about her father's unshakable optimism, her mother's quiet strength, and her brother Thomas's love for animals. Sharing her grief with him did not lessen its weight, but it made it less lonely. He would listen in silence, his dark eyes filled with a profound understanding. He knew what it was to lose everything. Their shared sorrow became another thread in the complex tapestry of their connection. One evening, they sat on a rocky outcrop as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley. A comfortable silence settled between them, a silence that was no longer empty but filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. "Why did you become a warrior?" Alara asked softly, the question one she had long wanted to ask. Nokai was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is the path of an Apache man," he said finally. "To protect and to provide, to fight for our land." He picked up a small, flat stone and turned it over in his hand. "The Pindalikoi come, and they do not stop. They cut down the trees. They foul the water. They kill the buffalo for their hides and leave the meat to rot. They think we are ghosts, that we do not belong to this land. But we were born of this land. Our spirits are in these mountains. To be a warrior is to be the memory of our people. It is to say, we are still here." His words were filled with a fierce, desperate pride, and a deep, abiding sorrow. Alara finally understood that the violence she had witnessed was not born of mindless savagery, but of a desperate, last-ditch effort to preserve a way of life that was being systematically destroyed. 78. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she gently placed it on his arm. It was a simple, instinctive gesture of comfort, of empathy. He flinched slightly at her touch, a tremor passing through his powerful frame. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. The fading light softened the hard lines of his features, and in his eyes she saw not the warrior, not the grieving widower, but a man torn between his duty and the strange, unexpected solace he found in the company of his enemy. He did not pull away. Instead, he slowly, tentatively, covered her hand with his own. His touch was warm and strong, a current of electricity passing between them. In that moment, the world fell away. There was no Apache warrior, no white captive. There were only two people, scarred by loss and surrounded by a world that would never understand, finding a moment of peace in each other's presence. The feeling that bloomed between them was slow, cautious, and intensely profound. It was a love born not of courtship and whispered promises, but of shared silence, mutual respect, and a deep, empathetic understanding of each other's pain. It was a dangerous, impossible love, a fragile desert flower blooming in the shadow of a war. They both knew it could not last. That the worlds they came from were on a collision course that would inevitably tear them apart. But as they sat there, hand in hand, watching the stars emerge in the velvet sky, they allowed themselves to believe, just for a moment, that it could. The fragile peace that Alara and Nokai had built for themselves could not remain hidden from the complex social and political currents of the rancheria. Their growing closeness, once a subject of quiet gossip, was becoming a source of open contention. A war party had recently returned from a raid on a mining settlement, their victory marred by the loss of two young warriors. Grief and anger were sharp, tangible things in the camp, and the presence of a white woman served as a constant, galling reminder of their losses. The pressure on Nokai was immense. He was a respected warrior, a man whose voice carried weight in the council. His prowess as a hunter and a fighter was unquestioned, but his treatment of the captive was seen by many as a weakness, a dangerous deviation from the path of a true Apache warrior. He had captured a trophy, a symbol of their defiance against the white invaders, and instead of treating her as such, he afforded her a level of respect and protection that bordered on affection. Alara could feel the shift in the camp's atmosphere. The wary curiosity that had replaced the initial hostility now curdled into suspicion. The women who had begun to offer her hesitant nods of acknowledgement now turned away when she approached. Even Sansure's visits became less frequent, her expression clouded with a worry that she could not voice. Kale was at the center of the growing dissent. He had never forgiven Nokai for the humiliation at the stream, and he saw Nokai's relationship with Alara as a personal and public affront. He began to speak openly against Nokai, his voice a poisonous whisper that spread through the camp. He spoke to the younger, more hot-headed warriors, feeding their anger and their grief. He invoked the memory of their fallen comrades, questioning Nokai's loyalty. Had the white woman's magic softened his heart? Had he forgotten the blood of his own people? One evening, Alara saw Nokai summoned to the wickiup of the chief, a stern, wise man named Taze. The council of elders and senior warriors had gathered. From her shelter, she could see the flicker of the central fire casting their grim silhouettes against the hide walls. The meeting lasted for hours. Though she could not hear the words, the tone of the discussion was clear. It was heated, contentious. She could pick out Kel's sharp, angry voice, and the low, steady rumble of Nokai's responses. Nokai's internal conflict was now a public battle. He was being forced to defend his actions, to justify his compassion in a world where compassion for an enemy was seen as a liability. He was trapped between the rigid code of his people and the undeniable pull of his own heart. His duty as a warrior demanded that he be ruthless, that he see Alara as nothing more than a symbol of the enemy. But his heart, a heart that had been awakened from its grief-stricken slumber, saw her as a woman of strength and spirit, a woman he had come to care for deeply. He returned to his own wickiup, which was near hers, long after the moon had risen. Alara, unable to sleep, was sitting just inside the entrance of her shelter, watching the dying embers of the campfires. He saw her in the shadows and walked over, his face etched with weariness. He sat on a log across from her, the silence stretching between them. "They want you gone," he said finally, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Kale says you are a bad omen, that the spirits are displeased. He says you should be given to the families of the warriors who were killed." A cold dread washed over Alara. She knew what that meant. It meant torture, a slow, agonizing death to appease the spirits of the dead and the grief of the living. "And you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you say?" Nokai looked up at the star-dusted sky, his jaw tight. "I told them you are under my protection, that you are my captive, and your fate is for me to decide. I told them that to kill a defenseless woman is not the way of a warrior. It is the way of a coward." Did they listen? Some, he admitted. Taze is wise. He sees that Kel's hatred is as much for me as it is for you. But the anger in the camp is strong. The young warriors listened to Kale. They are hungry for vengeance. He was caught in an impossible position. To continue protecting her would be to defy a growing faction within his own band, to risk his standing, and perhaps even his life. To abandon her to her fate would be to betray not only her, but the very core of the man he was becoming. "You should not have done this," Alara whispered, the words catching in her throat. "You should not have saved me. It would have been better if I had died with my family." Nokai's head snapped around, his eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce intensity. "Do not say that," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "To be alive is to have hope. To give up is to let your enemies win. You have the spirit of a fighter, Alara. I saw it on the first day. You have not given up." He stood and began to pace, the cold energy within him too great to be contained. "This is my struggle," he said, more to himself than to her. "My duty is to them. I have fought for them. I have bled for them. I buried my wife and my son in this land." He stopped and looked at her, his expression a raw mix of pain and confusion. "But my duty is also to my own heart. And my heart tells me that to harm you would be to destroy what little good is left in me." It was a confession, a declaration of his internal war. He was a man being torn into by the conflicting demands of honor, duty, love, and hate. Alara's heart ached for him, for the impossible burden he carried. She had been so consumed by her own survival that she hadn't fully grasped the depth of his sacrifice. He was risking everything for her. What will happen? She asked. Taze has given me 3 days, Nokai said, his voice grim. 3 days to decide your fate. After that, he will put it to the council. And I do not know how they will vote. 3 days. 72 hours. It was a death sentence, a countdown to a decision that would determine both of their futures. The fragile world they had built together was about to be shattered by the harsh realities of the world outside. The shadow of his duty had fallen upon them, and Alara feared that it was a shadow from which neither of them would be able to escape. As Nokai turned and walked back to the solitude of his own wickiup, Alara knew that the quiet whispers of their hearts were about to be drowned out by the drums of war. The 3 days Taze had granted Nokai were a period of unbearable tension. The air in the rancheria was thick with unspoken threats and hostile glances. Kale and the younger warriors who followed him grew bolder, their contempt for Nokai and their hatred for Alara becoming more overt. They would walk past her wickiup, making loud, derogatory comments in their own language, knowing she would understand the venom in their tone even if she could not grasp the specific words. Nokai was a solitary, brooding presence. He spent much of his time away from the camp, hunting alone in the mountains, as if seeking counsel from the silent stones and ancient pines. When he was in the rancheria, he was grim and withdrawn, his face a granite mask. The easy, quiet companionship he and Alara had shared was gone, replaced by a strained silence. They were both acutely aware of the ticking clock, of the life and death decision that loomed over them. Alara felt a paralyzing sense of helplessness. Her fate was being decided by men whose language she barely spoke, whose customs she was only beginning to understand. She was a pawn in a power struggle between Nokai and Kale, a catalyst for a conflict that had been simmering long before her arrival. Her only ally was a man who was himself at war with his own conscience and his own people. On the evening of the second day, a sense of grim finality settled over Alara. She could not bear the thought of Nokai being ostracized or harmed because of her. She also could not face the horrific fate that awaited her if the council voted against him. She had to take matters into her own hands. Escape. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. She knew the wilderness that surrounded them was a death sentence for someone like her. She had no food, no water, no real knowledge of the terrain. But to die free under the open sky seemed a better fate than to be handed over to Kel's brand of justice. She waited until the camp had settled for the night, until the fires had burned down to glowing embers and the rhythms of sleep had taken hold. Nokai had not returned from his hunt. His wickiup was dark and empty. This was her chance. With her heart pounding against her ribs, she slipped out of her shelter. She carried nothing but the small carving knife he had given her and a gourd of water she had saved from her evening meal. The moon was a sliver in the sky, providing little light. She moved like a ghost through the shadows, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. The camp dogs, who knew her scent, did not bark. She skirted the edge of the camp, heading for the trail that led up into the mountains, the same trail she and Nokai had taken on their walks. She had made it to the edge of the clearing, the dark wall of the forest just yards away, when a hand clamped over her mouth from behind, stifling her cry of alarm. An arm of steel wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was useless. It was Kale. She could smell the acrid scent of tiswin, a fermented corn liquor, on his breath. He was drunk, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent triumph in the dim light. He had been watching her, waiting for this. He dragged her away from the trail, into a secluded grove of cottonwood trees away from the main camp. He threw her to the ground. She landed hard, the air knocked from her lungs. The great warrior Nokai is not here to protect you now, white woman, Kale sneered, his English a guttural, mocking imitation of Nokai's. He lets his heart be softened by a pale face. He is no longer Apache, but I am. I will show you what we do with your kind. He lunged for her. Fear, raw and primal, gave Alara a surge of adrenaline. She rolled away, scrambling to her feet. The small carving knife was still clutched in her hand. It was a pathetic weapon against a trained warrior, but it was all she had. She held it in front of her, her hand trembling. Kale laughed, a low, cruel sound. You think that will save you? He advanced on her slowly, savoring her terror. He was toying with her, a predator playing with its food. He was not just going to kill her, he was going to break her, to humiliate her, to erase the defiant spirit he saw in her eyes. It was a personal vendetta, a way to strike at No-Kai through her. Alara knew she could not win a fight against him. Her only hope was to create a diversion, to make enough noise to alert the camp. With a desperate cry, she threw herself not away from him, but towards him, aiming the small knife at his face. Her move was clumsy, born of desperation, but it took him by surprise. He jerked his head back, and the stone blade raked across his cheek, opening a shallow but bloody gash. He roared in pain and rage, his playful cruelty instantly replaced by murderous fury. He backhanded her across the face, a stunning blow that sent her sprawling to the ground, the world exploding in a flash of white light. Her knife flew from her grasp. He stood over her, his chest heaving, blood dripping from the cut on his cheek. His face was a terrifying mask of hate. "Now you will die," he snarled, drawing the long, heavy blade he carried at his belt. Alara closed her eyes, a prayer for a swift end on her lips. This was it. The serpent had struck, and there was no one to save her. Just as Kale raised his knife for the killing blow, a blur of motion erupted from the darkness. No-Kai, moving with a terrifying silence and speed, slammed into Kale like a charging mountain lion. The two warriors crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, the sound of the impact a sickening thud. No-Kai must have returned to the camp, found her wickiup empty, and followed her tracks. His skill as a tracker, a skill he had tried to teach her, had now saved her life. The fight that followed was not a battle, it was a maelstrom of primal fury. This was not the strategic, disciplined combat of warriors against soldiers. This was a blood feud, a deeply personal and hateful struggle fought with fists, feet, knives, and teeth. Grunts of exertion and guttural cries of rage ripped through the night air, punctuated by the brutal, meaty sound of fists striking flesh and bone. Alara, her head reeling from the blow she had sustained, pushed herself up on her elbows. In the dim moonlight, she could see the two men locked in a deadly embrace, rolling on the ground, each trying to gain the upper hand, to find the one opening that would end the fight. Kale was larger and perhaps stronger, his movements fueled by drunken rage. But No-Kai was faster, more focused, his every move precise and lethal, driven by a cold, protective fury that was even more terrifying than Kale's blind hatred. The camp was beginning to stir. Shouts and cries of alarm could be heard as people, awakened by the sounds of the struggle, emerged from their wickiups. Figures began to run towards the grove of trees, their silhouettes stark against the distant campfires. No-Kai managed to break free from Kale's grasp. He scrambled to his feet, but Kale was right behind him, swinging his heavy knife in a wild, vicious arc. No-Kai ducked under the blow, the blade hissing through there where his head had been moments before. He drove his shoulder into Kale's midsection, sending the bigger man stumbling backward. Kale, though drunk, was still a dangerous and experienced fighter. He recovered his balance and lunged again, his knife flashing. No-Kai, unarmed, was forced to give ground, evading a series of furious slashes and stabs. He was looking for an opening, a moment's hesitation, but Kale, consumed by his rage, was relentless. By now, a crowd had gathered, forming a grim circle around the two combatants. Alara saw Taze, the chief, pushing his way to the front, his face a stern mask of disapproval. This was a violation of the camp's order, a fight between two of their own, and it would not be tolerated. But he did not intervene. This was a matter of honor, and it had to be settled. No-Kai, his eyes darting back and forth between Kale's knife and his eyes, saw his chance. As Kale lunged forward in a clumsy, overcommitted thrust, No-Kai sidestepped, grabbed Kale's wrist with both hands, and used the man's own momentum to twist his arm. There was a sickening crack as the bone snapped. Kale screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony, and the knife fell from his nerveless fingers. But as he fell, his other hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of No-Kai's hair and pulling him down. Even with a broken arm, his hatred gave him strength. He pulled No-Kai close and, with a final, desperate roar, sank his teeth into No-Kai's shoulder. No-Kai cried out in pain, a raw, animalistic sound. He slammed his elbow into Kale's head, trying to break the hold. But Kale held on with the tenacity of a bulldog. In that moment, No-Kai made a choice. The conflict that had been raging within him, battle between his duty to his people and his feelings for Alara, was resolved in a single, brutal, and public act. To protect her, he had to eliminate the threat permanently. With his free hand, he reached down and scooped up Kel's fallen knife. The crowd gasped. To use an enemy's weapon against him in such a way was a grave act. "No Kai, no!" Tase's voice boomed, a sharp command. But it was too late. No Kai ignored the chief. He ignored the horrified stares of his people. His world had narrowed to this one violent act. He drove the knife into Kel's side, once, twice, 3 times. Kel's body went limp. His jaw slackened, and he fell away from No Kai, his eyes wide with a final, shocked surprise. He lay still on the ground, a pool of dark blood spreading rapidly beneath him. Silence. A profound, shocked silence descended on the grove. The only sound was No Kai's harsh, ragged breathing. He stood over Kel's body, the bloody knife still in his hand, his chest heaving. Blood streamed from the vicious bite on his shoulder and from a dozen smaller cuts and scrapes. He had won. He had saved Alara. But the cost was enormous. He had killed one of his own. In front of the entire band. He had broken one of their most sacred taboos, not in the heat of a sanctioned duel, but in a raw, brutal brawl over a white captive. He had made his choice, a public declaration written in blood. He had chosen her over the laws of his people. Slowly, No Kai turned his head and looked at Alara. His face was battered and bruised, but his eyes were clear. The internal conflict was gone, replaced by a grim, resolute certainty. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. Then, his strength finally gave out. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the ground beside the man he had just killed. His sacrifice was complete. He had saved her life, but in doing so, he may have just forfeited his own. The aftermath of the fight was a maelstrom of confusion and quiet horror. The Apaches stood in a stunned circle, their faces illuminated by the flickering torchlight that some had brought. The sight before them was a tragedy. 2 of their own warriors and dead, 1 gravely wounded, and the white woman, the catalyst for it all, huddled on the ground, her face bruised and tear-streaked. Tase, the chief, took control. His face was like a thundercloud, his voice low and commanding. He issued a series of sharp orders. Several women, their faces grim, came forward and covered Kel's body with a blanket, their movements full of a solemn, practiced ritual for the dead. 2 warriors gently lifted No Kai's unconscious form and began to carry him back toward the center of the camp. Tazi's hard gaze fell upon Alara. For a moment, she thought he would order her killed on the spot, an easy resolution to the chaos she had caused. Instead, he gestured to Sansire. The old woman came forward and took Alara's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She led Alara not to her own isolated wickiup, but to No Kai's. It was the first time Alara had been inside. It was larger and more permanent than her own shelter, the interior neat and orderly. The air smelled of him of pine smoke, leather, and the faint, dusty scent of the mountains. Sansire pushed her down onto a pile of buffalo robes and then, without a word, left her alone in the dim, torchlit space. A short time later, the warriors brought No Kai in and laid him gently on a thick pallet of furs. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. The bite on his shoulder was deep and vicious, and a steady, dark stream of blood flowed from the knife wounds in his side. Sansire returned, followed by another, younger woman. They brought with them pouches of herbs, bowls of water, and strips of clean cloth. They were the healers, and they set to work immediately. Alara watched, feeling useless and numb. She was the cause of this. No Kai's life was draining away because of her. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. Sansire worked with a fierce, focused energy. She cleaned the wounds with a sharp-smelling herbal wash, her hands surprisingly gentle. She packed the deep bite with a thick, dark poultice and then began to stitch the gashes in his side with a bone needle and sinew thread, her movements quick and economical. The younger woman assisted, chanting a low, monotonous healing song, her voice a hypnotic drone in the quiet wickiup. But the bleeding wouldn't stop. Despite the stitches and the poultices, blood continued to seep through the bandages, staining the furs beneath him a dark crimson. No Kai's skin grew pale and clammy, and a fever began to set in. He tossed his head back and forth, muttering deliriously in his own language. By dawn, the situation was dire. Sansire sat back on her heels, her ancient face etched with exhaustion and despair. She looked at Alara, and in her eyes, Alara saw a clear message: he was dying. The Apache medicine was not enough. In that moment, something inside Alara broke. The fear, the helplessness, the guilt, it all coalesced into a single, fierce point of resolve. She would not let him die. He had sacrificed everything for her. She would not stand by and watch him slip away. She crawled over to his side. She remembered things, fragments of knowledge from her mother, who had been the healer in their small Pennsylvania community. She knew about fevers, about the importance of cleaning wounds, about pressure points to slow bleeding. Water, she said to Sansire, her voice firm. And more cloths. Clean ones. The old woman looked at her, surprised by her tone. But she saw the determination in Alara's eyes and gave a curt nod. When the water was brought, Alara began to bathe Nokai's face and chest with cool, damp cloths, trying to bring the fever down. She took a thick pad of cloth and pressed it hard against the wounds in his side, applying steady, relentless pressure. She remembered her father telling her once how an army surgeon had saved a man from bleeding to death by simply holding the wound closed until the body could begin to heal itself. Sansire watched her, her expression a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect. She saw that the white woman's methods were different, but she also saw that they were born of a desperate, focused logic. She did not interfere. For 2 days and 2 nights, they kept vigil. It was a strange partnership, the old Apache medicine woman and the young white settler, working side by side to save the man who connected their 2 worlds. They did not speak, but they moved in a silent, coordinated dance of healing. Sansire would change the herbal poultices, and Alara would continue to apply pressure, to cool his fevered skin, to force sips of water between his cracked lips. The camp outside was unnaturally quiet. The entire band seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. The reckoning for Nokai's actions had been postponed by his brush with death. His fate, and Alara's, now hung in the balance, dependent on the outcome of the battle being waged in this small wickiup. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. Nokai's breathing deepened, becoming more regular, and the bleeding from his side finally slowed to a sluggish ooze. He fell into a deep, natural sleep. Sansire placed a hand on his forehead. She looked at Alara, and a slow, weary smile touched her lips. She reached out and patted Alara's hand. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude. Later that day, Taze came to the wickiup. He stood over Nokai for a long time, his stern face unreadable. Then he looked at Alara, who was exhausted, filthy, but awake and alert. He killed his own brother, Taze said, his English slow and deliberate. Kale was a fool, his heart filled with poison. But he wasn't. The law is clear. He did it to save me, Alara said, her voice quiet but strong. He did it for a white woman, Taze corrected, his voice sharp. He has brought shame to his name and division to our people. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the evidence of her tireless care of clean bandages, the bowl of cool water, the exhaustion etched onto her face. But you, he continued, a note of wonder in his voice, you have the heart of an Apache woman. You did not run. You fought for his life. Sansure says it was your medicine, your spirit, that called him back from the edge of the Black Trail. The chief was a pragmatist, a leader who had to weigh tradition against the survival of his people. Nokai was one of his best warriors. To execute him or to banish him would be a great loss. Kale had been a troublemaker, and many in the camp, in their hearts, were not sorry to see him gone. Nokai's actions, while a violation of their laws, had also removed a source of dissent. And this white woman, she was no longer just a captive. She had proven her strength and loyalty in a way that none could deny. Nokai has broken the law, Taze said, his voice taking on a formal, judgmental tone. He must be punished. When he is well enough to stand, he will be exiled from this band for 1 full cycle of the moon. He will hunt alone, live alone. He must purify himself in the mountains. He then looked directly at Alara. And you, your status has changed. You are no longer a captive. You are now the reason for a blood debt. You are tied to him. Your fate is his fate. Where he goes, you will go. It was a brilliant if harsh solution. He would uphold the law by banishing Nokai, but the punishment was temporary. It would allow the anger in the camp to cool. and by tying Alara's fate to Nokai's, he was placing the responsibility for the outsider squarely on the shoulders of the man who had brought the trouble to their door. The reckoning had come, not with a sentence of death, but with a judgment of exile. They would be cast out, sent into the wilderness to survive on their own. For Alara, the verdict was not a punishment. It was a reprieve. It was a chance. A chance to be with the man who had sacrificed everything for her, alone, away from the hatred and the judgment of the world. A month later, when the moon had completed its journey across the night sky, Nokai was deemed well enough to face his exile. His wounds had closed, leaving behind angry, puckered scars that would forever mark him as the man who had killed his own kind. His strength had not fully returned, but the fierce pride of a warrior would not allow him to show any weakness. The morning of their departure was cool and gray. The entire camp gathered in silence to watch them leave. It was not a hostile crowd, but a somber, watchful one. Taze stood before them, his expression stern. He handed Nokai a bow, a quiver with a dozen arrows, a knife, and a small pouch of cornmeal and dried meat. It was a meager provision, a symbolic gesture. They were being sent out to depend on the spirits and their own skills. Alara stood beside Nokai, a small bundle of her own containing the carving knife, a water skin, and a warm buffalo hide that Sansure had pressed into her hands. The old woman had embraced her before the camp had gathered, a brief, fierce hug that spoke volumes. In their shared vigil over Nokai, a bond had been forged that transcended race and culture. Taze spoke, his voice carrying across the silent clearing. You are banished for one moon. You will live as a ghost to your people. When the moon is full again in the sky, you may return, if you survive. His final words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the challenge that lay before them. The wilderness was unforgiving, and a lone man, still recovering from his wounds, was vulnerable. A man with a white woman in his care was even more so. Nokai gave a curt nod to his chief. He did not look at the faces of his people, the people he had fought for, the people who were now casting him out. He turned his gaze to the mountains, his jaw set. He looked at Alara, a silent question in his eyes. She met his gaze and nodded, her expression resolute. She was ready. They walked out of the rancheria in silence, the eyes of the entire band following them until they were swallowed by the forest. For the first few hours, they did not speak. The only sounds were the crunch of their footsteps on the pine needle-strewn path and the sighing of the wind in the tall trees. They were truly alone now, two outcasts bound together by blood and circumstance. The first week was the hardest. Nokai pushed himself relentlessly, his body still weak from his injuries. He was quiet and withdrawn, the shame of his exile a heavy cloak upon his shoulders. He hunted with a grim determination, bringing down a rabbit or a squirrel for their evening meal. Alara did her part, gathering edible roots and berries, using the knowledge he had taught her. They worked together as a team, a silent, efficient unit focused on the single goal of survival. They found shelter in a shallow cave, its entrance hidden by a curtain of ancient junipers. At night, they would huddle together under the buffalo hide, sharing their body heat against the biting cold of the mountain nights. It was in these moments, in the shared darkness, that the walls between them would begin to crumble. I am sorry, Alara, he whispered one night, his voice thick with a pain that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. I have brought you to this. You would have been better off without me. No, she said fiercely, turning to face him in the dark. You saved my life, Nokai. More than once. You sacrificed your honor, your place with your people, for me. I will never be sorry for that. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He captured her hand, his grip gentle, and brought it to his lips. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, an admission of the love that had grown between them, a love they had never dared to name. As the days turned into weeks, the harshness of their exile began to transform into a kind of freedom. Away from the judgmental eyes of the camp, they were no longer Apache warrior and white captive. They were simply a man and a woman. The shame began to fall away from Nokai, replaced by a quiet contentment. He taught Alara how to set snares, how to move silently through the forest, how to read the language of the stars. She, in turn, brought a softness back into his life that he had thought was lost forever. She would sing quiet songs from her childhood as they sat by the fire, her voice a gentle melody in the vast silence of the wilderness. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their two vastly different worlds, finding common ground in the universal experiences of love, loss, and hope. They fell into a natural rhythm, a domesticity that was all the more precious for its wild setting. They were partners in every sense of the word, their lives completely intertwined. The love between them, born in violence and nurtured in secret, was now free to blossom in the solitude of the mountains. For 3 weeks, they lived in a world of their own making, a perfect, fragile paradise. But the moon, a silent arbiter of their fate, continued its inexorable journey across the sky. As it began to wax towards fullness, a new tension entered their idyllic existence. The end of their exile was approaching. They had to make a choice. "We cannot go back," Allura said one evening, voicing the thought that had been haunting them both. "Even if they accept you, they will never accept me. Not truly. And I cannot live in a world where I am the cause of your shame." "And you cannot go back to your world," Nokai countered, his voice grim. "They would see you as tainted, a woman who has lived among the Apache. They would not understand." And the first he paused, the words catching in his throat. "I cannot let you go." They were trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither. To return to the Apache meant a life of being outsiders. To attempt to enter the white world was unthinkable. Nokai would be hunted and killed, and Allura would be shunned. Their third option was the most dangerous of all: to run. To leave the relative safety of the Apache lands and strike out on their own, to find a hidden valley, a corner of this vast, wild country where they could live in peace. It was a fool's hope, a dream in a world that had little room for dreams. They would be hunted by both sides: be the Apache, who would see Nokai as an oathbreaker who had not returned from his exile, and by the Americans, who would see an Apache warrior and a white woman who had clearly gone native. The night before they were to return, the moon hung full and luminous in the sky, bathing the mountains in a ghostly silver light. They stood on a ridge overlooking the vast expanse of the territory, the distant lights of a settler's town a tiny, faint glimmer on the horizon. "There is no easy path for us," Nokai said softly, pulling her close. "I know," she whispered, leaning her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "But whatever path we choose, we will walk it together." The story of Allura and Nokai does not have a simple ending, for the world they inhabited was not a simple place. Their choice remains a whisper on the wind, a tale told around lonely campfires in the heart of the unforgiving West. Some say they chose to disappear, to become legends, a ghost warrior and his white-faced companion who lived out their days in a hidden canyon. Their love a silent testament to the idea that even in a world defined by hatred, compassion could forge a bond stronger than any tribe or nation. Others say they tried to return, and their story ended in tragedy, a final, bloody chapter in the long and brutal war between two peoples who could not find a way to live together. But whatever their final choice, their story remains. It is a story of a fierce Apache warrior with a gentle heart, and a resilient white woman who found her true home in the arms of her captor. It is a testament to the fact that in a world torn apart by conflict, the most profound battles are often fought within the human heart, and the most triumphant victories are those of love, forgiveness, and the stubborn and yielding hope for a world that might have been.